Russia may be shunned by many around the globe for its invasion of Ukraine, but it has found friends in Africa. Russia has been long tied to the continent, stretching back to the Cold War and at times helping many liberation struggles gain independence from colonial rule. At the United Nations on Wednesday, South Africa was among 24 African countries that declined to join the resounding vote denouncing Russian aggression. 16 African countries abstained, 7 didn't even vote at all, and 1, Eritrea, voted against it, keeping company with only Russia, Belarus, Syria and North Korea. Well, to talk a little bit more about this, we're now joined by South Africa's former ambassador to Eritrea, Ambassador Professor Iqbal Jhazbhay. Thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter. It's good to be back.
All right. So before we get into, the countries, Eritrea in particular, just give me a general sense. I suppose when it comes to Russia, Africa is always going to be divided depending on the history.
Indeed. Most countries will vote according to their very own national as well as geopolitical interests. As you mentioned, many countries on the continent at the moment have very strong military as well as economic ties with Russia. So you see in the context of the vote which Eritrea chose to undertake, it took into account its own geopolitical interests as well as its historic national interests in making that particular discussion, Peter.
All right. Well, let's talk then about Eritrea. Most African countries chose to abstain. And I guess what it says when you abstain is we're not going to vote against you, but we can't go all out and endorse your invasion. I suppose that's how we translate it. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, it is a correct assumption. And it comes back to the point as to what is the state of bilateral relations between that particular state, its foreign policy, and its particular immediate interest. For example, in the case of Eritrea, the historic relationship between Russia and Eritrea has not been a very healthy one. We recall that Eritrea fought, according to many scholars, the longest anti-colonial battles. First, there were the Italians there for some 52 years. Then came the British for some 11 years. And then started this war against a own continental neighbor, and that's in the form of its second most populated country in Africa, where the Eritreans had to fight the Ethiopian state at that point under Haile Selassie and the government of Mengistu. So during that context, the Russians in the Cold War era were supplying arms to the then Ethiopian government. So the historic relationship has not been very good, but more recently, since particularly 2011 onwards, when the Eritrean government and its policymakers undertook an assessment, they came to the conclusion that it's better to now work with the Russians more closely, given this particular history. So they've exchanged ambassadors, they've started a few economic projects, and also the fact that historically the Eritrean military had Russian aircraft, and many of those Russian aircraft, given the Ukrainian air technicians are very familiar with it, were brought to Eritrea to service those MiG aircraft. And that gives us some sense of the political complexity in the past. But currently, the US has decided to unilaterally impose economic sanctions on Eritrea. So when the Eritrean policymakers had to assess the balance of political, military, and regional geopolitical balance of forces, they opted to vote against the US and in favor of Russia because they believe that will secure their interests and it will be more in line with the AU and according to the Eritrean government and the non-aligned movement principles of not having single country resolutions against any country, the principle of avoiding double standards in human rights, and so forth. So those are some of the broad framing of the Eritrean response to exactly why they voted on this resolution against the resolution and in favor of Russia.
It is interesting because to vote no is quite a definite statement. It goes beyond abstaining. Eritrea, as you help me understand, it's been described as the Cuba of Africa. Cuba itself, also under US sanctions, could not bring itself to vote no. They too abstained, but one knows the relationship that it has with Russia. So Eritrea went a step further. So was this a vote for Russia or a vote against the US or a bit of both?
I would see it on two fronts. The Cubans are very close to the US, just a few kilometers away from Cuba, and there are a number of complexities, including the fact that the US in the state of Florida, the city of Miami, hosts a huge Cuban diaspora population. And whereas in the case of Eritrea, it has had a long history with the US in the sense that when it formally got independence after the referendum in 1993, they had very healthy relations with the US. In fact, the then US ambassador had direct access to the Eritrean president, Isaias Afwerki. But the relationship started taking a huge nosedive when the US was a signatory for the Ethiopia-Eritrea border well-known Algiers peace agreement, which South Africa as well is a signatory to that agreement. The US took this decision not to implement the Algiers peace agreement. So from then on, the Eritrean government decided not to accredit an appointed US ambassador to Eritrea, but to keep the relationships at the level of charge d'affaires. During the time of Obama, there were a number of national security advisors which favored a closer relationship with Ethiopia at that point because they viewed Ethiopia as a strategic partner on what was then known as the War on Terror. And so then the relationship with the US soured further. During the Trump period, interestingly, there was some reconnecting of diplomatic relationships. Trump's State Department received the foreign minister of Eritrea. But once again, when the Democratic Party came back into power, the same national security advisors who were in office during the Obama period started implementing the same approach they had implemented during the Obama period. So my sense is that Cuba had to assess it's a very close call for them to vote in favor of Russia. So they chose to abstain, like South Africa. And Eritrea felt that it could send a very clear message to the US that it doesn't agree with these unilateral US Treasury and trade sanctions, once again, on both Eritrea and Ethiopia. So I think those are some of the factors which have to be considered as to why Cuba and Eritrea took two very different positions, in spite of the fact that they have very cordial and warm relations with Russia.
All right. So in the past, since the Cold War, Russia worked very hard to get allies on the continent. It seems that in recent years, Russia is working hard to increase the closeness of those relationships. We had the Russia-Africa Summit, I think 2019, and one scheduled for later this year, again bringing African countries closer. What do you think this is? Is this about, again, a different type of Cold War with America, or is this economic now? And Eritrea probably now is in the front row, given what they've done at UNGA.
My sense is that the Eritrean leaders and their foreign policy specialists, when they did a mapping of what would best serve their national goals, namely to preserve their self-determination, their independence as a country, and also to nurture this Ethiopia-Eritrea peace agreement, we recall these U.S. Treasury unilateral sanctions have been imposed both on Eritrea and Ethiopia. And it took a long while that both leaders of Ethiopia and Eritrea took a decision that to preserve this peace agreement, which was signed in 2018, and to take a number of steps to nurture that peace agreement. So they both felt, although Ethiopia took a different road in voting at UNGA, at the UN General Assembly, but the Eritreans have always, like Cuba and many other states, remained very principled in its foreign policy. Not only there did it vote against the U.S. and favor a decision more in favor with Russia. At the last the UN Human Rights Council, it also voted against a U.S. push to undertake an investigation into the Russian role in the Ukraine. And there too, it took the position to vote against that resolution on the basis they would argue that the U.S. did not push for a UN Human Rights Council resolution to investigate the U.S. role in Libya, the U.S. role in Iraq, or the U.S. role in Afghanistan or Syria. So that's the sense I'm getting as to why they particularly move in this direction. And clearly, yes, there's an affirmative answer to your question that most African states have military agreements with Russia. And as you correctly mentioned, the aspects of Russian companies getting involved on the continent, as well as military bases, including in the Horn of Africa, is being explored and being established more strongly now than ever before.
All right, let's talk a little bit about Eritrea itself. As somebody who spent quite a number of years there as South Africa's ambassador, South Africa was a signatory to the 2000 border Algiers peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and also the development of the 2018 Asmara peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And in and amongst all of this, we saw the Prime Minister of Ethiopia get a Nobel Peace Prize. I just wonder what that has meant for Eritrea in terms of peace, because now we have stories of Eritrea being involved in places such as Tigray.
Yes, Peter, it's a pertinent question. The region has sadly suffered from what we would call a huge amount of external meddling, or what one analyst more recently referred to, a huge amount of geopolitical traffic, meaning the presence of external players. Like you correctly pointed out, you had the Cold War era where the then Soviet Union had bases there, then the Americans took over, and more recently, they've taken this, I believe, unfavorable position of not allowing the regional leaders for themselves to come up with homegrown agreements, but to develop their own framing of the problems there, both in Ethiopia and the backlog of political nation building, of economic development from their very own angle, which has not favored US interests. So what that has really done, it has given the entire Horn of Africa to China on a plate. So China is heavily involved in Ethiopia with a huge number of development projects, economic projects, and the same applies in Eritrea, alongside with South Africa, the mining companies in gold, copper, zinc, and potash. The Tigray issue is simply an issue where the Tigray People's Liberation Front could not deal with the fact that as the minority party of no more than 10% of the population, that it had lost power now to a new prime minister, Prime Minister Abe, and that it had to come to terms with that. Instead, the TPLF sullied a lot and was sulky about it, and it decided to attack its largest Ethiopian military base in its own region. And that led to the unfolding of a war situation in Tigray. And this is when then the Eritreans, the political leaders, as well as the key political leaders in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, including Prime Minister Abe, had a common purpose. That is to defeat the TPLF and to get them to come to the table to discuss, to dialogue issues. And fortunately now, Ethiopia passed the National Reconciliation Bill, and last week, Saturday, much of the reconciliation group processes have started with the many political deficits and problems which Ethiopia faces as one of the second most populated country. And many of those political unresolved deficit issues have to now be resolved at the earliest. And I'm glad that many of the neighboring countries like South Sudan, Kenya, as well as Eritrea as the new peace partner in the region, as well as Uganda, are giving it the requisite support to see that the peace agreement signed between Ethiopia and Eritrea succeeds. It's a seminal peace agreement and homegrown agreement. The other big players just came into the picture for a good congratulatory photo shoot.
All right. Professor Ambassador Iqbal Jhazbhay, thank you so much indeed for joining us. I look forward to chatting to you again, particularly with the good knowledge you have of that region. Thanks for your time tonight.
It's a pleasure, Peter.